You're watching the YouTube version of the We Are Innovation podcast. Join us as we explore how innovation, new technologies, and human creativity improve our lives. The future is calling.
Hi, I'm Federico Fernández. Welcome to a new episode of the We Are Innovation podcast. This episode is part of the cooperation partnership that We Are Innovation and Access Partnership have. Access Partnership is the world's preeminent tech advisory firm. They've been helping leading tech companies navigate complex regulatory challenges and expand their product and services to new markets since 1999. In this time, they've also worked closely with governments to offer advice on creating policies and regulations as the landscape continues to change with the new and emerging technologies. Today, we're going to talk about how to encourage innovation and choice in the taxi industry. And for that, I am accompanied by Cheng Wei Swee. Cheng Wei is a senior manager at Access Partnership based in Singapore, in the Singapore office, with expertise in technology and sustainability. He is part of the economics strategy team. Cheng Wei is one of the leads for sustainability in the firm, having managed multiple engagements on plastic waste, including waste flow analysis and sizing of plastic circulatory opportunities, and developing mandatory reporting and EPR strategies for packaging. Online, you can find him on the website of Access Partnership. I'm going to leave a link below in the description. Cheng Wei, welcome to the We Are Innovation podcast.
Hi, Federico and listeners of We Are Innovation. Right, happy to be here and looking forward to our discussion.
Thank you for your time. We really appreciate it. And well, as you know, because you are one of the co-authors, Access Partnership has recently published a report titled Rethinking Taxi Pricing and Reforms, Spurring Innovation and Choice in the Taxi Industry. Well, the first thing I want to ask you is what was the primary motivation behind this study, and why did you study taxi pricing reforms across certain specific markets and cities?
Thanks, Federico. So I think there's two parts to your question, right? One is on the topic and also one is on the coverage. Right, and on the topic, I think we just share some of the context behind why we explore even this taxi pricing study. So firstly, we have been talking about digital transformation for a while, right, since a while back. And our studies have shown that there is a great potential for many industries, including traditional ones like agriculture and transport, to really reap the benefits of current and upcoming technologies like mobile devices, Internet of Things, and artificial intelligence, and their related innovative applications. Right, so this has been really in the background, churning along, affecting different industries. And then we turn to the taxi industry, which has served as the cornerstone of transportation models in many cities. Right, people have seen it as a complement to public service. In some countries, is sort of public transport in itself. Right, and there has been shift in the different needs and expectations of both drivers and riders that necessitate change. Right, so change is already ready, right, to look at. And then, for instance, riders, including you and me, right, when we take the different kinds of transportation, we have grown to expect different kinds of standards of service, like the ability to choose and pre-book taxi rides with the knowledge of the exact price that we will be paying, and also choice for different kind of situations and scenarios, right? So when we look at this, yes, innovation is already happening. Innovation is affecting the kind of consumers like you and me. And as a result, the taxi industry is really ripe for change, right, signaling a need for the current and often legacy kind of models to evolve, just like any other industry, just like any new technology affecting an industry. And however, when we look at many different cities, well, it's encouraging. Many of different cities are actively looking at how to review and reform different policies, right? We do see there's a lack of consolidated tech base on taxi pricing to guide and inform decisions of regulators, right? For instance, many of these new innovations might not have traditional metrics to size them, right? So they do not know what to do, go ahead. They might not even know what they are measuring, right? So there's a lack of consolidated tech base. And that's where we come in, right? In Access Partnership, in the economic strategy practice, we tend to try to aid the decision-making process right, by quantifying impact, good or bad, right, so that policymakers and other stakeholders could get a better decision. And hence, this report really aims to bridge that gap by providing an analysis of the impact of differentiated taxi pricing on the taxi drivers and riders, highlighting the limitations and opportunities. So that's really on the kind of objective or context on why do we even dive into this topic. Then the second part is the market, right? Why do we select 3 different market of interest in East Asia and 4 different cities, sample cities across the world? And there are reasons why. For the first bucket or first category of markets, which is the 3 countries in East Asia, South Korea, Japan, and Taiwan, right? We look at it because they are major geographies that has not embarked on major taxi pricing reform, right? So they pretty much keep to the same regulations for a long time. At the same time, they have strong strict hill taxi services. The government desire is to boost utilization, efficiency, and affordability for the taxi transport industry in overall. And they are all known as urban innovation hub, right? For many other things that they're proud of, right? But in the taxi industry, perhaps they're still thinking about and navigating your way, right? So those set a context about, okay, perhaps this is it's a good kind of first initial starting ground. Geographies who has a interesting background but hasn't really get started on the taxi pricing reform journey. So that's the first category of markets we look at. The second category of markets are the 4 sample countries, settled sample cities, right, with differentiated taxi pricing, right? San Francisco, Singapore, Sydney, and Vienna. And we try to draw insights about how incremental efforts in allowing for differentiated taxi pricing could have impact on the taxi industry. So what we did is we went through a prioritization process, right, looking at all different cities that has hit the different criteria, right? Whether they have taxi regulation, looking at e-hail, right? Whether they have recently went through some taxi reforms, right? Whether they are open to reforms, etc. And we also take account a few different other criteria, such as hopefully we have a good geographical spread, right? To be able to compare different things, and also whether they are suitable peer economies to the 3 East Asian markets, right? And hence these 3 countries, these 4 sort of sample cities provide a good kind of peer comparison. And the interesting thing is they have been chosen also to inform the evidence base because they are at different stages of the reform and could have taken varied approaches to approaching the same topic. For instance, Singapore has deregulated taxi pricing, allowing the market to bring about innovative solutions, while others like the San Francisco are still going with pilots, but the pilot is widespread, broad enough, right, to have a good coverage and to have good outcomes. So hence we see that learning from these cities, which has started this journey, which are further up in the sort of reform process, and they have different kinds of learnings, right? Both publicly and also when we talk to different interviewees, right? They provide a good base for us to compare and provide learning. So hence, this is sort of the in short, how do we select the topics and also select the markets to deep dive in.
Just out of curiosity, what can you give us? Because I lived in that city. What were the things that surprised you most about Vienna, if any, or what's your view about it?
It's interesting, right? They have different views between the riders and drivers, right? We see that riders are less optimistic about taxi apps and also on ride-sharing apps, right? Compared to the average of the 4 sample cities. But we see drivers having a bit more optimism that these apps will help them in their utilization rate, their earnings, right? So we do see there's a difference, right, in this. And Vienna provides a different kind of picture because they are not fully differentiated, right? They have different kinds of mechanisms to protect riders and drivers. They have price caps that the prices have to meet those caps, right? So that's interesting because it provides different learning for other regulators looking to reform their taxi pricing.
Thank you, Cheng Wei, for satisfying my longing of Vienna. It's a magnificent city, but on the other hand, there was a joke that circulated, and I heard it there for the first time, that many people say that the best place in which the end of the world can find you is in Vienna because it will arrive 50 years later.
Perhaps tell the story that, yeah, there's a different kind of optimism from the riders and the drivers.
Indeed, yeah. But coming back, and thank you for the great introduction you gave to the study and to put us all in the same ground. What do you think are the taxi regulations and policies that should be adopted in order to change the current transportation landscape?
Right. And I think that, thanks for the question. I think the question is really layered, right? Because every sort of market and new city is unique, right? The geography, the market dynamics, the kind of players involved, and will really require different solutions. And it might be more productive to really think about the principles on how do you step forward, right? And I think really we have a few different things to consider. One is how do we, policymakers should acknowledge that innovation is happening, right, in this digital transformation era, which is something also encouraged by governments, right? So they're saying that let's pursue digital transformation, they have roadmaps, but when it actually hits different industry, right, perhaps they are more resistant to change, right? So one thing is acknowledge that innovation is happening and could have positive implication on the transport industry, but recognizing that there could also be negative implication to look out for, right? So one thing is just coming to the point that innovation is happening. The second one is to prioritize the needs of drivers and riders, right? Because from our study, we see that drivers and riders do actually have a view, right? They do actually prefer something. They do prefer the choice, right? And so all this might not surface, right, if their voices are not heard. So prioritize the needs of drivers and riders, right, while tailoring any regulations to the local context. So it's understandable that regulators are resistant about new policies, but much can be learned, right, as hopefully channeled and communicated by this study, learn from those who have managed to successfully balance innovation, growth, and the needs of key stakeholders, right? So one is to really prioritize the needs. The third thing that policymakers would think about is to relook taxi policies, regulations, right? Exactly what this study is supposed to do, to rethink some of these reforms that happened a long time ago, and to see whether innovation is restricted and what are data gaps. And there are a few reasons why, right? For instance, like many other policy areas, we are living in a very different time and situation, and we'll need to constantly amend our regulations to meet the different technologies that are available. And the second thing is, as many technologies are relatively new, right, and might not be captured by our traditional impact measurements, right, the gross domestic product, etc., right, we sort of lose sight on the kind of importance of the implication, right? So for instance, do we understand the right taxi rider satisfaction with the taxi trips and the perception on taxi pricing options, right? And without perhaps such a study, which we believe is first of its kind to put together a consolidated view on perception by riders and drivers, right, we might not be having further conversations about it. And the sort of last thing to take note of is to be open in the reform process, right? Understand what works and what doesn't work in other countries that are more advanced in thinking, consider pilots to collect the data, right? And also engage broader stakeholders like riders and drivers. For instance, from our research, we unpack several policy levers that can help policymakers looking to implement differentiated taxi pricing options. And one of the pushes is to encourage transparency, right? Because regulators should be open with the public on partnerships, on taxi data, of course, the non-personal ones, the costs and other variables when seeking to implement taxi pricing on e-hail and on sort of rideshare apps. And in Vienna, we realized that the government regulators conducted quite a robust process, right? As you know, right, with 2 studies to really ensure transparency and to outline their reasoning behind the decision to update the taxi pricing model, right? With more clarity, people are on board and aligned. So ultimately, really, there's no one-size-fits-all sort of solution, and regulation should be tailored according to the local market context. Well, as I said earlier, while Singapore and Sydney have deregulated their taxi fares, San Francisco and Vienna did not, but they allow and maintain differentiated taxi pricing to allow a wide range of options and choice for riders and drivers. And we know that for certain populations, such as the elderly, disabled, and those individuals without smartphone, so we're not going to push that everything has to go digital, right? There still is a time and space for sort of legacy pricing, and I refer to through a taxi meter, looking at time taken and distance traveled, right, for these people, right? Even for tourists, right, traveling to different places, they might not be used to the kind of mobile infrastructure there, right? So I guess that, in short, it's good to look at it holistically, and also the principles that I mentioned earlier.
Cheng Wei, you introduced this idea that you and co-authors developed very well during throughout the report, which is the notion of the policy levers that policymakers have in order to introduce differentiated taxi pricing policies. If you can expand about that, I think it would be great.
Yep. So I guess the policy levers really is looking at when we look at the 4 different sample case studies, right? What are some of the practices that they carry out that are effective, that we actually carry out that are useful for to move the kind of discussion forward. So by no means they are sort of best practice, right? Because every country is different, every city is different, but by something that others should consider these principles. And also, we are not going to sort of step by step, do A, do B, do C, do D, because as I said earlier, we know that every country will require different things. But in the study, we outlined 6 different common practices that can be seen across the 4 case study cities, right? So things like ensure flexibility and choice in regulation. So that's number 1, and it's key, right? Because from our survey insights, and you realize that we keep repeating that riders and drivers value choice, right? The choice to decide on choose different pricing at different situation and timing, right? And that's very key to them, right? So for a policymaker making reform decisions, when they look at it, their end outcome to say that this should allow for choices, right? And in some places, drivers do not want upfront pricing, right? They prefer the meter pricing, which is fine, right? They are used to the kind of taxi meter, they are used to the kind of surety that it gives. But to others, they prefer not to have taxi anxiety or meter anxiety, right? When they sit in the taxi, they want to know exactly how much they pay, right? So in any case, for a good principle for a policymaker to ensure flexibility and choice. And this is brought about by innovation in sort of ride sharing and taxi pricing apps. The second one, when you look at it, is to develop pilot programs, right? And incentivize participation, right? And from there, really, you can have as much discussion as you want, but when you put it into practice, you see some instance where it works, it doesn't work, right? In Japan, there was a pilot previously, but it didn't have good results, right? Because it was so easy to get a street hire taxi, right? Compared to using a mobile app, right? There's negative reception, feedback on the service provided by the e-hailing apps, right? There is other things like if a driver were to calculate their earnings on the app, it took longer than expected rather than accepting cash, right? So all this didn't surface until there was a pilot, right? And then they learned from the pilot. So likewise, in San Francisco, they have multiple pilots, right, to really test the different options on differentiated pricing, on partnership with existing taxi companies, and those produce different results, right, which are then shape the regulation. So how do we develop pilots that can allow us to have credible data, right, to move forward? The third policy lever that we suggested is to establish a framework to educate drivers, right? Because when we look into our study, right, while most acknowledge the benefits of upfront pricing or differentiated pricing other than meter pricing, right? Hence the idea of differentiation of tax fare types. And they realize that it helped them in different things, right? It helped them to go to places with the highest demand. They help them to increase their earnings, to look at their utilization. But there's another group of drivers who say that I don't know about these benefits, right? I understand the term itself, I understand the kind of logic, but I don't understand how it affects my bottom line, right? So really while the technology might be good, or the technology might be advanced, or it might be user-friendly, right? But basically, if the rider or driver do not understand what is it about, right, they can't really fully utilize it, right? Hence, oftentimes when we talk about technology, it's often the scaling part as well, right? How do we upskill people to use it well? So that is the third one on educating, establish a sort of skilling or education framework. The fourth element is to diversify the employment environment for drivers. In many of the places in East Asia, we see that there is a lack of drivers, right? One, it could be due to the low pay, right? Due to the long hours, due to the aging population of the drivers, right? And then how do we make sure that there's enough drivers to do it? And while sort of ride-sharing apps, etc., could sort of mitigate it because they allow part-time employment to come in, right? There could be other ways to look at it, right? How do you make sure that, how do you move the kind of application process from all manual based to online based, right? So people move with time, right? And find it less intensive to cop through the different hoops, right? How do you make sure there is enough protection, right? Basically on other things like a sort of insurance, medical coverage, etc. on such occupation. So let's diversify the employment environment, right? Because even if you have the best, and hopefully with the kind of findings that we are presenting in the report, where upfront pricing could help drivers earn more, right? Earn more overall, right? They might have shorter trips, they earn less per trips, but they have more trips overall. and this could potentially increase their earnings over time, right? And with that, potentially incentivize people to enter the trade. The fifth policy lever that we put out there is to really prioritize multi-stakeholder collaboration. And I think this is across many different kinds of policy reform, right? How do you get in touch with the whole range of stakeholders, from government officials to taxi industries to ride-sharing drivers, right, to consumers, to hear their views? And the interesting fact is, when we look into the different case studies, for instance, in Singapore, right, when there is ride-sharing apps that came in to sort of revolutionize the sort of market and people have options, the taxi industry are the ones that go to the government and say that, hey, can we also have changes to our regulation so that we can also accept upfront rides, right, which is not heard of in the taxi industry for a long time, or for ever since before, right? So really, it's kind of push where stakeholders, once they're activated, they realize the importance of it, they come into the play. And even things like San Francisco, after the first pilot involving upfront pricing, taxi operators reach out to the government and say that, can we be part of the second pilot, right, where we can allow our fleet to be used by the Ubers, right, by the other kinds of ride-sharing apps to get taxi rides. So really, the kind of multi-stakeholder process is important. And finally, as I touched a bit earlier as well, is to ensure transparency, right? How do the public get involved on, what are the different pilots out there? What is the available data, right? Why did the government do certain regulations or amend different regulations, right? And it's really is to allow different stakeholders to be satisfied that the end outcome will be useful for both riders, drivers, and the broader society, right? So hopefully this paint a picture on sort of briefly about the 6 policy levers that might be useful, or hopefully will be useful for policymakers looking into this area.
One question, sorry, and this goes beyond the report and just to know your personal opinion.
Yeah.
But you mentioned, San Francisco and pilot programs there of, changing the pricing policies. And San Francisco is the place in which Uber was born. I dare to say, a long time ago. I mean, Uber is not a 2 or 3 year old company. It has already several years. I know this is perhaps there's no answer to this question, but why it took, and it's already taking so long for the taxi industry and the taxi regulation to accommodate to the new realities? Because as you said before, technology has happened, a lot of innovation has happened already, and why we are having, in a way, we're having this discussion. It's fascinating if you think about it.
Yeah, it really is, right? I mean, look at this. There are, I think, a few different points to flag out. So one, as I said earlier, people are resistant to change, right? So while they talk about broad pictures, when they actually affect their livelihood, when they affect their jobs, perhaps they will react in a certain way, right? So a case in point, previously in Singapore, right, we released a congestion pricing, right? It's called a sort of electronic road pricing that can tax people on usage, car usage. Right, back then, it raised a lot of questions about users and consumers and drivers. Why are we paying for road usage, right? But eventually, you fast forward years later, it's sort of marked as the best practice, right? Because this is how you can effectively control traffic, right? So likewise, right, back then, there were complaints, there were resistance, and even in the 4 sample cities, there were different kinds of resistance to it. And so I think one is definitely down to there's unknown certainty on how does it affect the different key stakeholders, including policymakers, right, including the taxi industry, etc. The second thing is innovation. I think people takes time to catch up with it, right? As you said, Uber previously operated for a long time with other operators like Lyft and in San Francisco, right? And the whole idea of ride sharing, it took a while also to get into people's mind, right? To be accepted, right? How do I get a private car to take me from point A to B, right? How do I trust it? Is it safe, right? And that's a journey that sort of many cities have went through. And then it went on to, how do I share a ride with somebody else, right? Not only a private ride, but share with stranger A and stranger B to solve the idea of carpooling, right? Some cities are still debating that or going back and forth regulation. But in this particular study that we do is focus on the taxi industry, which, as you know, is the cornerstone of the transportation sector. Many places they are the monopoly, right? Many places they are resistant to change, right? And how do we say that for taxi rides, am I able to give them upfront rides other than meter rides, And to many people will be no, right? Because I'm so used to the taxi meter being there to accurately calculate my fare fairly, I do not want to trust other things, right? So a lot of these factors, and if you look at the demographics, a lot of taxi drivers are sort of on the upper scale of the age band, right? So really it's another factor on people who are more resistant to digital adoption, digitalization, right? So all these factors, when you put them together, we see it's sort of no surprise, right? That it takes such a long time, right? And perhaps it took an even longer time, right? If perhaps some countries haven't pushed forward innovative ways of thinking about it and inspiring others, right? So hopefully there's a short answer to your question, but I'm sure that it's will spark of different discussions.
Very, very enlightening. Thank you. And I have, I'm sorry, it's my job. I have to put you in a difficult spot now because I have to ask you, you did this amazing study, this amazing report evaluating cities, countries, it's an international. And I have to ask you who's doing the best job and who's doing not so much the best job. What let's say what would you say, not to be so harsh, what are the best lessons we could learn from certain cities or countries?
All right. So however, an analysis of tech cities that are further down the reform journeys compared to the starting point of just traditional taxi pricing, restrictive pricing model of simply time and distance traveled on the taxi meter, we see that across the 4 case study cities, it demonstrated positive benefits that could be unlocked through differentiated taxi pricing options. Right? We do see that it brings up upfront pricing, which is different from the traditional model of just the meter one, bring about things like choice for both rider and drivers, which are appreciated by them. While we see that there's increased earnings and utilization for drivers, we do see there's reduced waiting time and fares for riders, all important taxi matrix, right, for any point-to-point industry, right? So, and if we didn't allow differentiated pricing in the first place, all these benefits wouldn't have come, right? Because people have only one option and the only options to have. So in short, really, places with differentiated taxi pricing seem to fare better, right? And when you ask me which countries, perhaps it's this 4, right? And because when you look at this 4, there are at different stages as well. Some are earlier with actual regulation in place. Some are at the early stage with pilots, but comprehensive pilots, right? Some have deregulated taxi pricing to allow free innovation and free market access. Others have a sort of a more caps and limits to ensure that there's some safety nets, right? So really it's all different. And hopefully this applies to any other cities out there who are thinking about it, that there is an option that fits your city, right? There's an option that allows you to explore innovation within things that you're comfortable with, right? So hopefully those are some thoughts about the question.
I have two questions for you to finish. The first one is, we are in a way, you mentioned, to that, and I mean, you mentioned in very properly that a proper regulation should keep in mind the needs of riders and drivers. But there's a part of this equation, if you allow me, that could disappear soon, which is the drivers, in the sense that autonomous taxis and autonomous cars in general seem to be closer than we thought. How, let's say, what do you see, what will be the future of riding in general, the future of pricing policies, and everything that you've studied in this fantastic report, with this possibility that will be definitely a revolution?
Interesting question, right? And I think that there will definitely be advancement in technology, right? And we look across it, there are so many, right? There are things like your drone delivery, right? Your autonomous vehicles, right? Your next generation satellite road pricing and road congestion pricing, right? So all this will definitely come into play. But I think there are a few things to point out here, right? That one is, I think the current discussion on differentiated taxi pricing will likely continue, right? And likely to stay, right? A few reasons why. Right, because pricing models and pricing mechanism will still be relevant no matter different kind of models that we have in the future, right? It could be an autonomous vehicle, but the rider will still have to decide on what kind of fares that they want to choose when riding those rides, right? So that's one. Two is, while there could be changes, right? Perhaps it's not in the next 5-10 years, it could be a little bit stretched out. So really in the next few years, taxis will still continue to be an important sort of cornerstone in many transportation industry, right? Especially now as we go into a car light area where we want to have less private ownership of cars, etc. Really, you want to depend on public sort of transport, including taxi, right? So really, the whole discussion between taxis and riders, the whole dynamics on fares will still continue, right? And so that's another one. And really, when you look into the whole journey on differentiated taxi pricing, we have so many different cities at different milestones, right? So some cities are just thinking about the thing, right? They're hit by different comments and feedback from the commuters, from riders, from drivers that they want to look into this. They are looking at disruption from technology. They want to look into this, right? So very early on the pricing, nothing changed yet. There are others in the sort of the midpoint where they have pilots, where they are monitoring data to tweak their different policies. And others are the far out where they have already advanced and reaping the benefits or mitigating some of the risk that comes involved, right? So really, they're sort of part of that whole discussion now, right? And I think in the next few years, this will still be it. On the flip side, when you say that there potentially could exist I guess, hypothetical or perhaps not so hypothetical that drivers might lose their jobs, right? In essence, right? And then it's interesting because in this study, we also asked drivers about their whole perception on the gig economy, right? How do they look into their jobs as drivers, right? In some places, they're called employees. In some places, they're partners. In some places, they are just regular people just doing part-time work with the app platform. And when you look at it, they have a strong push on upskilling. They have a strong push on rescaling, right? Perhaps they don't see it as a full-time job. They don't see it as a long-term career, right? Many of these are in-between jobs. Many of them are just to supplement income, right? So really, hopefully, right, they get the sense that there could be drastic changes that's coming in the future that I want to safeguard my career, right? And one of it is to upskill to do other things, right? Perhaps as a business development leader in the company itself rather than a driver, right? Perhaps is to learn other skills, run a business on the side while we're having the flexibility of doing a driving job, right? So really, when you look at it, it is multifaceted, and it's because of this, right? Many of such apps exist, right? To really accommodate different people, different career options and different kind of decisions and stages, right? So to your question, I believe technology will continue to evolve. Pricing will continue to stay because it's such an important discussion on the minds of drivers and riders. And in the future, hopefully drivers are also upskilled, as they have pointed out that this is something that they really want to look at.
Cheng Wei, and now I want to, before letting you go, I want to, when I introduce you, you have done a lot of work also regarding sustainability, particularly in plastic. The COP discussion is coming we're recording this at the end of September. It's coming very soon. And the issue of plastic, how to handle it, what's the role of companies, let's say soda companies, for instance. What can you tell us about that? For people like me who basically get their news about these issues through the news, and sometimes we don't know what to think. I know it's a very broad question, but it's a very broad topic, and it's a very important topic. It's interesting that experts like yourself, can give us, a scenario of what's going on. Maybe if there's some good news that we don't know, or hopefully not a bad news. What can you tell us about what's going on, let's say, regarding the how we handle and how we would deal with plastic nowadays?
Well, Federico, you give me another 1 hour of talk time, but yes. But really, I guess there is, of course, the whole idea of climate change, everything is still scary and it's still real, right? A lot of people are not taking it seriously enough, or stakeholders not taking it seriously enough. But I guess there's some optimism that the conversation in plastics particularly have moved quite a bit, right? In 5-6 years ago, there's organizations not talk to each other about what they are doing, what they are funding in this space, what are the pain points they are looking at. And there are many sort of duplicative effort in this, right? In APEC, where a lot of plastics or marine debris is found, right? Many of the same project of the same nature are being funded, right? So depriving other important problems to sort of be looked at. But now 5-6 years later, there's a lot more coordination, there's a lot more strategy, a lot more roadmaps to tie in different situations. And I guess that's really one of the big optimism that people are looking at it holistically as an industry. So that's one thing to point out, one area of optimism that changed from A to B. And like the taxi industry, right? You see why it takes such a long time to have change, right? Really, it's because there's so many different stakeholders involved in it. The second one, when we look at it, is really people are starting to understand the importance of technology to solve some of this issue along the plastic waste value chain, right? And previously, we are going it a lot of the manual processes, and we talk about contamination rates, we talk about waste in the oceans. But along the years, we do see many venture capitalists that are investing in technology that focus on this area, focusing on sorting, focusing on recycling, focusing on picking up trash in the ocean, and many have moved leaps and bounds, right? So another sort of area of optimism among all the doom and gloom, right, is there is technology involved in it. A lot of innovation that's happening in this space, drone technology to capture the real picture on waste that are out there, sorting mechanism that can recycle really, really trashy and really contaminated rubbish, right? And all this kind of things, right? So that's the second series of optimism that there's technology involved. And the third one, of course, that's something to note that, the international community has came out with a draft, right, on what they want to do in the plastic space, right? That took a while to happen. But in that space, it's still broad, right? But the whole idea that the international community want to look at it. And some of these key points that flash out of it is how do we look at recycling, right? It's like recycling the golden bullet or silver bullet, right? And a lot of times it's not, right? It's reducing the kind of production upfront. But that being said, it's perhaps easier than the actual daily usage of plastics, right? We still need to use it for many different things. There's not really a lot of suitable alternatives, right? There are, but it could be expensive, right? So there are so many different kinds of layers to look at. But one thing that I think is progressing well is this idea of extended producer responsibility, or EPRs. Really is how do you make producers and by extension consumers pay for or internalize the kind of waste that they put out, right? It could be charging them extra for the excess packaging that they use, right? It could be charging them extra for certain things that they discard improperly, right? So really, how do you really internalize some of this behavior? And similarly, we did a study in ASEAN, looking at 5 different ASEAN countries on the perception on businesses, food and beverage businesses, consumers, and governments also on this whole plastic issue. And you see quite interesting results. We did one study in 2020 and one study in 2022. And really, because of COVID, a lot of new patterns are being discovered as well. And some things where they sought out to really change, perhaps didn't have the resources to change them over time. Right, so all in all, there's a lot of doom and gloom, right, as you see in the papers, but there are hopefully these threads of optimism that you can pull, that there are people across the globe, across the industry, across the value chain, trying to solve some of this issue. And likewise here in Access Partnership, in my team, where we look at it in a sort of holistically way, right? One, from the investing kind of arm, right? Are there particular areas to invest in, right? Other areas to diversify. We look into the kind of strategic and quantification arm. How do you size the problem? And also downstream, right? How do you measure impact, right? Is it really moving on well, right? And so really it takes, I guess, the entire global community to really move something. And hopefully I can have another session to really talk more in depth, but hopefully this provides some food for thought.
Thank you. No, indeed, and Cheng Wei, I hope we can talk soon about this second part of topics that you also do very well, because it's extremely important, really, and you're an expert on that subject as well. Thank you very much for being with us. To everyone who listened to this, don't forget to subscribe on any platform you use to listen to podcasts. You can also do it on our YouTube channel. And we'll meet again in another episode of the We Are Innovation podcast.
Thanks for watching this episode of the We Are Innovation podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe. To know more about We Are Innovation, visit weareinnovation.global.